Hi, I'm Luke,
And I'm TJ.
and welcome to Beyond the Building.
Give me the Bible, holy message shining. Thy light shall guide me in the narrow way. Precept and promise, law and love combining, till night shall vanish in eternal day.
Welcome to Season 2, Episode 14 of Beyond the Building. We are very happy that you've joined us in this Bible study. As always, we publish episodes every Friday at 9:30 Eastern Standard Time on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. So any of those platforms we are available on, and we would love it if you joined us in this discussion. I thought of the word, and now I forgot it. The mantra, the premise, there we go, that's a good word. The premise of this show is that oftentimes, key word from last week, oftentimes we will be in our assemblies with the saints, the times where we gather on, say, Sundays and our midweek Bible studies, but all these times we will assemble in our church buildings, and we'll be invigorated, on fire for the Lord, encouraged by the fellowship. But then when we remove ourselves from those situations, we might get bogged down, we might lose energy. So the goal of this show is to encourage Christians to go beyond the building, beyond just having this fire for God in the church, and really having a zeal for God's word and a desire to grow every single day. Before we get into this week's episode, our regular occurrence of stickers. Stickers is the topic for right now. We have recently purchased stickers, and the deal is that if you comment on the episode, you are eligible to win a sticker, and you have your pick of either a triangle with our logo on it or a circle with the triangle of our logo on the inside of it. Whoa, but hey, they look different and it's cool. So comment on an episode and you are eligible to win one of these stickers, and if we announce you as the winner, please email us and we will find a way to send you one of these stickers. Our winner for this past week is, drum roll, invisible drum roll, Daryl Curd. Mr. Daryl Curd, thank you so much for commenting, being a watcher, supporter of the show, and you win a sticker, so yippee, yay stickers. Feel free also to join the newly created Beyond the Building community on Facebook. This is a group where we can just get together, get to know you all a little bit more. This is obviously a pre-recorded show, so we don't get to talk to you guys all that often, but it is enjoyable when we do. So please consider joining that community, and this will be a place where we can get to know each other, where we can study more, go a little bit more in depth into the topics that we might not be able to cover as much specifically on the show. And with that, it is Luke's turn for story time this week. Luke, what do you have for us this week?
I don't really know if it's I was struggling to come up with a story, and I guess it's not that great because I had like 2 weeks to do it. I was out last week. So I guess this is my story, explaining what happened. So yes, as was stated on the show, I did get sick for just the day. So I had some vague flu-like symptoms.
Just
so I
the
guess
day?
I guess
What?
it wasn't. Well, I started feeling bad the day before, and then
okay.
I ran a fever last week, and then I felt better immediately afterwards. Still kind of recovering though, was just feeling kind of out of it. I guess it wasn't meant to be for me.
Yeah.
But we'll have to revisit that topic later, so I can make comments. But thank you to Matt for filling in for me. He did a good job. So
Yes. Thank you. A huge thanks. I would be remiss if I didn't thank our guest host last week, Matt Jones, for sitting in on the show and filling in for Luke. Hopefully, we will be able to get more guests in on the show and be able to get some new perspectives, get some different ideas generating here on the show. This is a bit of a different show than we've done before. It's going to be a little bit unique. We have a lot of topics that we will think about covering on this show, and we'll kind of run through them and see which one is interesting to us or maybe applies to us currently that we might be able to easily study and throw together in a good amount of time. But we were finding that a lot of these topics were very, very specific. Some of these questions that we would like answered on the show are more specific than to make a whole 45 to 50-minute episode on, right? So the idea was to do a Q&A. So we're going to open it up, and we will have these question and answer sessions pretty regularly, depending on how we feel, that goes, and how maybe based on demand as to what you guys think of it. But so we will have this Q&A, and the goal is to grab these questions either from questions that we have, questions that we've studied, but also questions that you have submitted to us. So this would be from the comments on YouTube, from the Beyond the Building community, from email, whether we, wherever we get those questions from. So please feel free to submit us those questions to be on these episodes when the time comes. So, many times people will have all these questions, but either be too afraid to ask. They either think the questions are important or they think the questions are just too hard, so they'll be like, okay, well, there's probably just no use in answering this question in the first place. But per the theme of this show, we think it is important to ask questions. I don't think there's really a time where God says, don't ask questions, right? God opens his work up to questioning. And that is the amazing thing, is that we can look at the Bible and we can analyze it. We can ask, well, is this the Word of God? God always provides us this proof and this evidence that we have the ability to ask questions, and God will answer those questions. So these specific, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, right? It's not doubt or a failing on our part if we have questions. Mm-hmm. It's a sign of a critical mind. Mm-hmm. that you do ask questions and that you don't just take things at face value, right? The truth has no fear of investigation. Well, the Bible is true, and everything in it is open to our investigation, and we shouldn't be worried about that or intimidated by it. It's something I think that it can be productive if done in the right way.
Yeah, most definitely. So these specific questions, we have 3 of them that we're going to answer today, and these are ones that we thought were either important to ask because of specific life application, so doctrinal significance, or, in the case of one of these questions, just interesting to postulate. There are questions like the age-old question of, did Adam have a belly button? This is interesting to postulate and has no doctrinal significance whatsoever, but it is something interesting to note. As to, well, I wonder why God would make XYZ choice, or, something like that. So just some interesting topics to cover. So our first question is going to be, what is the serpent in the Garden of Eden? There are a couple of thoughts about this, and Luke, could you kind of take us through the couple maybe options we have here mainstream-wise?
Yeah, so before I do that, I want to kind of give an introduction to this question. So this is one that I actually added to our topic tracker. And it first came to my mind when I was in college. I was in an honors class at Freed, Hardman, and the premise of this intro to honors class was every week you had to generate 10 questions to ask. And you had to post it to this message board that we could all see, and you had to answer or try to answer some of these questions.
Interesting.
And so, being a Bible major there, several of my questions were Bible related, and I was thinking of something that maybe I was thinking of several things where we sometimes just make assumptions, or we say something and there is not really. It's difficult to prove. And one of those was that it's often said that the serpent in the Garden of Eden is Satan. And I've heard that my whole life. This is what it is. This is the answer. And I started thinking about it, and I posed this question. It was really contentious, so I wanted to perhaps do an episode about it. And the problem, quote unquote, the problem stems from a reading of Genesis 3, 1 through 15. I'm not entirely sure it's best for the sake of time to read all of this, but I did want to draw our attention to kind of the main aspect about here. First of all, Satan's name is not mentioned in this passage. The devil is not mentioned, etc. And then the language in Genesis seems to be saying that the serpent is just a serpent. It says in Genesis 3:1, now the serpent was more subtle. I'm going to switch to New King James, just for fun. If I can find it. Here we go. Now the serpent was more cunning than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, has God indeed said, you shall not eat of every tree of the garden? Right, so right there it says, it was more cunning than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And that's kind of interesting. It immediately poses or compares the serpent to a beast of the field, right? There's no mention of anything spiritual going on here, but then it says it's more cunning, and it's if this is an animal, it's a very intelligent animal. Hence, it talks in the next passage, and then later when God is cursing the serpent. In verse 14 it says, because you have done this, you are cursed more than all cattle and more than every beast of the field. Again, comparing the serpent to a beast of the field. On your belly you shall go, and you shall eat dust all the days of your life, and I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. The question kind of stems from the fact that you can read this passage. Not only you can, but if you just read this passage without having any prior knowledge, you would walk away saying, okay, so apparently there were talking snakes.
Yeah.
Which is, at least for me, growing up in the church, it's kind of, I guess if I was reading that for the first time, that is what I would say.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the premise. Do you have any thoughts on that so far?
No, not really. I think, like you said, colloquially, at least to my understanding, this serpent was the devil himself who took the form of a serpent somehow, right? And we'll kind of get into these comparisons between the three, I guess, ideas, or four actually that we have here, that we can kind of test and see. It's interesting, what might this actually be? So the first, obviously, this serpent is a literal snake, and I'd never heard that until you brought this up. So this would be, we were talking in our conversation before this about how dolphins are incredibly smart. You look at parrots, how they can imitate human language. So there is, in the animal kingdom, there is this ability for animals to at least mimic human sounds and to have intelligence to some degree. Now, is this the same intelligence
the snake here would be beyond anything else? Yeah.
Correct. Now, is this the same intelligence, say, that a human would have? That's an interesting question, right?
Well, from what you see, you're tempted to say yes, because the snake, first of all, talks in complex sentences, which no other animal does, and the only thing on earth that does are humans, aside from, I guess, if you want to say, like, when angels come to earth, and etc. It not only is intelligent enough to do so, but it would be intelligent enough to try to get something or to try to, like, obtain something. So it's not just intelligence, but it's also directed.
Well, it also has the type of free will that is found in humans and angels.
And
right?
has knowledge of spiritual matters, apparently.
Yes, so it is a different level of intelligence that is not found within the rest of the animal kingdom. Which, at least to me, makes it less likely that it's like just a literal snake and then that's it, at least in my humble opinion. Our second explanation of this text is that the serpent is something figurative. Now, this is, I would say, a more common argument and explanation for what this is than just he's just a snick, you know, he's a little snick. So can you kind of elaborate more on this figurative interpretation of that?
Yeah, so when I was kind of researching this initially, one of the things that I looked into was kind of what did Jews think of this passage? What did the original audience think that this meant? And the most popular interpretations were these two, that it was literal, or that it was completely figurative, that it was representative of the innate like temptation.
Yeah, just temptation as an idea.
Yes, it was personifying almost the desire to sin, which, poetically speaking, sure. But and this I think it's maybe a more niche topic, but this is definitely a topic for another episode. I think the literalness of Genesis, because I feel like that goes just beyond the first 3 chapters. But the rest of Genesis, including what has come before and what comes after, is written in literal language. There is no tone shift. There is no poetic construction that you see in the books of poetry, and so, and that's including Genesis 3. So for it to be something figurative would basically, it would be as if you took Aesop's fables and you stuck in a historical account of the Vietnam War, and then you said, "Oh, this one thing is historical," even though it's sitting in a sea of poetic stuff.
Yeah, it's like, how do we tell the difference?
Yeah,
if it's so buried in there.
Yes,
know?
it's kind of pulling at something that's not there to try to explain it.
Yeah.
The next kind of Anyway, did you have any theories about that?
Go ahead.
Okay. It's not my preferred interpretation. I don't like that one. The next popular interpretation is that the serpent is literally a demon or Satan himself. So that's, I think, it's probably the second most popular, I want to say. I don't have statistics on this, but just from personal experience, probably the second most popular among modern Christians, that it is like Satan shape-shifting into a snake. The Hebrew word here, Nahash, maybe I'm saying that right. I'm not a Hebrew guy. I'm much more of a Greek guy. Nahas, I don't know. But it is translated literally throughout Genesis to refer to a snake. This would be the only passage in which it's used to, not the only instance, but it would be one of the only 3 instances to where it's meant to be kind of figurative or meant to represent something other than an actual snake. There are a few more instances. The word itself actually comes from a term, if I have this correct, I may not be understanding this fully, but it comes from a term meant to refer to a constellation, a flying serpent, and then also someone who practices divination is kind of closely associated with that constellation. I'm not 100% sure on that. I mean, this is like ancient Eastern history, so take it with a grain of salt. But then also in Genesis 49:17, Dan is compared to a serpent and an adder. So that's kind of the other instance in which an intelligent being is referred to a snake. So perhaps, right, Satan is just being referred to as a snake in Genesis 3. I guess that's kind of the theory.
Yeah.
But probably the thing that supports this the most, and in my mind makes this one of the better theories, which I do think it is a better theory, is that in Revelation 12, Satan is compared to a dragon and an old serpent.
The serpent of old.
Yes. And so while I was researching this, I found that there's kind of this transformation, if you will, through history of what the interpretation was. Before the intertestamental period, it was kind of referenced to be literal or to be completely figurative. And then in the intertestamental period, there is a work that is not canon, but it is the Wisdom of Solomon, in which it talks about the envy of Satan brought sin into the world. obviously not canon, but it's something to consider, right? There was kind of this idea, at least, before Christianity came onto the scene, that the serpent, or at least Satan, was involved somehow. And then in the first century, early church fathers, recognizing Revelation 12 to be very similar language, kind of drew this connection.
Yeah.
And even we read the curse on the serpent, right? There's a fancy name for this, but all it basically means is the first prophecy about Jesus, because early church fathers said, "Hey, if this in Revelation is referring to Satan as a snake and a dragon, well, that makes nice narrative sense in Genesis, especially given the curse." Verse 15 says, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." And often that's meant to say, right, or that is claimed to say that God is saying, right, Satan, you are going to hurt my son, the offspring of man, Jesus, in a physical death, but then he's going to rise from the dead and absolutely destroy you.
Yeah, ultimate victory,
Yes.
as opposed to just a physical victory for Satan.
Yes. And so narratively speaking, this makes, I think, the best sense.
Yeah, definitely. So, it begs the question, why isn't it explained in Genesis? Like, if it is,
there's one more theory.
Yes,
Right,
which
before
is
we go into that.
yeah, which is that the serpent is possessed.
Yeah.
So, similar to Legion, in the gospel accounts. And it makes sense for a couple of reasons, because it allows for that literal reading of serpent, right? Mm-hmm. It explains the snake's ability to speak. It also explains the serpent's knowledge of greater spirituality. I think a funny analogy is like, you never see our dog. If we're talking about evolution, kind of, and the fact that animals don't have that higher form of reasoning, and how could it come about if not for a higher deity putting that in us? I've always heard like, well, you don't see our dogs like contemplating the meaning of life over a sunset,
Yeah.
which is true.
That's fair. And this wouldn't be the only instance in which something like this happens, right? Balaam's donkey in Numbers 22, 21 through 35. Angels could at least allow animals to speak.
Yeah.
So this wouldn't be the only time in which you would see that. So this is also, I think this is probably the most popular theory, and it does make sense, and it also narratively makes sense. So those are probably the most two popular explanations. But anyway, as you were saying.
Yeah, no, I kind of explain another point with that is that why doesn't God explain that? Why doesn't the Holy Spirit say, well, this is what's happening? We don't know, right? It's just a question, It's like, man, sometimes the Bible will be written in a certain way, and it's like, God, why didn't you explain this way as opposed to this way? It's like there are always those questions that we want answered as people. And it's good to have those questions, like you said. But ultimately, this question is not a matter of salvation. It has no bearing on whether or not doctrine changes or not. So it's okay if that answer is something that's not explicitly stated, because whether or not it is or is not, it has no effect on whether or not we can live our Christian life the correct way, the way that God wants us to.
Yeah. And I think, right, we're trying to answer questions, right, during this episode.
Which is ironic, because the first question
is kind of like not really an answer. This is my opinion on, a layman historian. I'm not a historian, or I'm not an expert in examining ancient literature, but this is kind of my impression of what happened. People drew connections because they're there, narratively speaking, right? Revelation draws this connection between Satan and the serpent. And then over time, that became, this is the answer. My personal opinion is that I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that that is narratively satisfying. I think it explains a lot of the logical problems that arise if you read this either to mean, oh, it's just a snake, no other explanation. But then also that's not a completely devoid literal reading of the passage itself.
Yeah.
So I think the answer I would say is it's complicated, and we need to have a level of humility that, okay, well, the Holy Spirit did not view it to be that important that we are explicitly told what the answer is.
And that's one of my favorite answers that we'll give on this show is it's complicated.
It's complicated, guys.
I think we just need, hey, the next BTB sticker is going to have it's complicated. I got this. BTB, it's complicated. That's like our catchphrase, our slogan. It's complicated. Who knows? So our next question is the preacher a church leader? Now, I would like to start this off by kind of stating the difference between pastor and preacher, right? I think we love defining words on this show, and the pastor comes from, and I don't have any notes on this, so correct me if I'm wrong, because that is the Greek poimen, right, which is shepherd, and then translated into Latin, pastor. So there's this meaning elder. So we would use some terms interchangeably. Bishop, presbyter, elder, what's another one? Shepherd. Episcopos is overseer. So all these are used to refer to the same office in the scriptures. So we look at the qualifications of elders in Titus and also 1 Timothy? 1 or 2 Timothy? I can't remember.
Good question. I will find out.
Yes, so we see those qualifications of elders, and those terms are used interchangeably. 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1, 5 through 9. So it's important to remember that when we see the word bishop, when we see the word overseer, shepherd, even pastor, as some translations say it, those are all referring to the office of the elder. So these are the leaders, the office that God has designated as the shepherds over a congregation. And we see in the scriptures that there are always a multitude of men that are over that. So there is not one single man in charge of each congregation. Oftentimes, great. So dead, honestly.
Counter. Ding.
No. Hey, we hold us accountable on this show. We will see in the denominational world a one-man band type thing where there is a singular pastor, quote unquote, who does everything, who teaches. And I personally think that this is because this is the person that we see. Because it's the person that we see standing up, giving lessons, talking to the congregation, addressing things, that this role of a gospel preacher has become the pastor. And we'll see this in it's either 2nd or 3rd John, talking about Diotrephes, where he's trying to rule over everything. Now, in these cases, in the modern world, there may not be any ill intent, but it's still one guy running everything, and there are a lot of problems that come with that. So my point with that to say is that there is a big difference between a gospel preacher, one who preaches the gospel, which that was Timothy, that role of a preacher, an evangelist, and a pastor, elder, overseer, XYZ, who is the designated a designated office that God has ordained, similar to deacon, different offices of that nature. So that's kind of the intro to this.
Yeah. Anyone, this is perhaps an important distinction. Anyone can be a quote unquote preacher or teacher, in so much as the fact that we are each obligated to teach the gospel to others. Mm-hmm. And this is where perhaps a bit of our tradition has maybe clouded our judgment, or at least it makes it difficult to wade through, right? We do have an example of men going to congregations and being the quote unquote teacher, but most of these examples are apostles, right? Especially with Paul, or they're men designated by apostles to go and establish a congregation, and to teach them quote unquote proper doctrine, if you will. to establish order. The system we have in the modern era of every congregation has their own designated preacher who just preaches to them, and like that's their job. That's not. It exists in some fashion in the New Testament, but the system as we have it now is not found, I would say,
Yeah.
in the New Testament.
Yeah.
It's something that we've done because it's perhaps easy, or it makes it easier on us to have a person who goes to school for this so that they can come and, teach us. It makes it easy. But it's not an office or a position
Yeah.
as a deacon or an elder or overseer is.
Yeah.
Those have qualifications. They have well-defined roles.
Yeah. So we would contend that the role of a gospel preacher is an expedient to teach, right? Because gospel preachers are not necessary. We understand that elders, as a part of their role, should be qualified to teach.
Apt.
Apt
The word
to
is
teach.
apt there, which
Yes.
is interesting, right? I'm not picking on anyone in particular, but I've known overseers in my life that I never saw teach the gospel or teach a Bible class. Apt means willing and able.
Yeah.
If so, anyway, yes, you must be willing and able to teach.
Yeah. So that's not just, that's not to say that it is not biblically authorized to have a gospel preacher. We are most definitely authorized to teach each other and to have, it's biblically authorized to have a man come up and lead the congregation in teaching. That's completely God ordained and God authorized. Now, however, if we look at this man as the leader of our congregation, that's where we have different issues. So is the preacher a leader in the church as an elder would be with the eldership, the group of men that gets together and makes these decisions collectively for the congregation? No. There is no designated office of gospel preacher. However, is the preacher a leader in the church? And I would definitely say yes, inasmuch as any man would be a leader in the church, one who leads singing, one who leads prayers, right? Mm-hmm. In that regard, yes, one can be a leader. Would a lady who leads a Bible class be a leader in the church? Yes, of course. Of course, that is not the same thing as saying, let's have this lady become an elder and lead the congregation. It's kind of semantic range, I guess. But, like what do we define as a leader? But we're not going to get into semantics with that.
Yeah.
But
on this point, right, I haven't met anyone personally that says, oh, yes, I haven't met anyone in the church that says that a preacher has the same authority as an elder or an eldership or anything like that. Mm-hmm. But I have met people that treat them that way.
Yep.
And this is, I'm going to call back to Freed Hardeman. I went through freshman year all the way through senior year with a lot of these guys. And perhaps that made me a bit jaded because I know them personally. Mm. And everyone's flawed, and so I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that, like, there's lots of reasons that people become preachers. Not all of them are good. Yep. And there is a lot of times, not even a lot of times, but sometimes, men will become preachers because they want the respect and they want to feel seen. Yep. Right? Well, they feel that way because often that's what's given. Anytime anyone does any sort of leadership for the church, we ought to respect that. We ought to be supportive, be critical when necessary, right? But show our support. But we need to make sure that we're not showing preferential treatment to the hired preacher just because that's who they are or they went to school for it, right? Preachers can be wrong just like anyone can be wrong. Anyone can be wrong. one of the, and this is kind of, I don't want to say it's off topic because it is related, but one of the things that irritates me is if people say, people will encounter something that another member said and they disagree with it and they say, oh, well, I gotta go call my preacher about this.
Yeah.
It's okay to check with people who are knowledgeable
Yeah.
and that you trust. But if your answer is, I can't think, I need someone else to tell me what to believe, I can't think for myself. Well, that's no better than people in the denominational world saying, okay, well, I need to go ask my pastor about this. I'm not sure what you're saying is right.
Yeah.
We need, I'm getting into a lot of different tangents here, if you can't tell. We each need to be well-equipped to handle the scriptures.
Yep.
And we need to make sure that we're not using the preacher or anyone as a crutch for our lack of knowledge.
Yeah.
It's going off on a tangent, but I'm passionate about this. I went to school for lots of reasons, but one of them was to get a Bible degree, but not because I wanted to be a preacher, but because I wanted to learn about the Bible. And lots of preachers do go because they have a passion for God's Word, right? We all need to have a passion, and I'm not saying that you need to go and get a degree for it, but we all need to have a drive and a passion for God's Word that we ourselves will learn what the Bible has to say about whatever the topic may be.
Yep. So, the crux of the matter is there is most definitely a difference between the role of a preacher and the office of an elder. We must respect the eldership that, that we are under, who, these men fit the qualifications of elders in the scriptures, and that is a very high office, right? You carry a lot of responsibility, a lot of weight with that. The preacher does not carry that same responsibility to shepherd the flock like an elder does, most definitely not. So it's something to note, and we must be careful to not be preacher worshipers in that, oh, well, I love this gospel preacher, so I'm just going to go with everything he says, kind of like what Luke was talking about. And look, do what?
Dude, don't get any, I'll say it.
He's getting riled up over here. But hey, it's very true. If we're not careful, these men who are very wise, very knowledgeable, and who, even some men who are actually behaving in a really biblically sound manner, it can be our fault, that it's like, oh man, this is such a great man, I'm going to look to him for everything. It's like, man.
Well, I'm not, when I say this, I'm not trying to say like, oh, copy me, but
sure.
I tend to try to live my life in a inquisitive, questioning manner, right? I've never met anyone that I've agreed wholeheartedly with anything that they've said, and not just to be contentious, right? But I've said, I think that point or that viewpoint is wrong because of this passage.
Yeah.
I think that, and I'm saying this about every man I've ever respected, every preacher I've ever respected, any elder. I've never been 100% on board with everything, and that's because, right, I think we're all flawed. I don't expect anyone to 100% agree with anything I ever say. Yeah. And everyone thinks that they're right about the things that they believe. Otherwise, they wouldn't believe them. Yeah. Right? Yeah. There are so many complex things that go into this that if I'm shocked that people will be like, oh, so-and-so is so great. I love everything they do.
Everybody's got their bugs.
Yes. Well, you're unfortunately, you're loving at least one thing wrong because they're a person and they have flaws. And so we don't need, like you were saying, we don't need to be blinded by our love and respect for people.
Yep,
that we stop questioning things.
Yep,
anyway.
100%. So our last question of the day is going to be based off of 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 16. And the question being, should women wear head coverings? We see this passage, and there is a natural question, I think, that is very good to ask of, well, does this apply to us today? It's important to make distinctions based on, okay, what does and what does not apply to us. We see, the apostles meeting in upper rooms. Does that mean we are obligated to meet in upper rooms today? Well, no, of course not. We would contend that is expedient. We need a place to meet in order to assemble. and we see various different means as to how that is accomplished in the Scriptures. So the question is, where does this fall in that reasoning? Is this something that is bound today as doctrine, or is this something that is an expedient that deals with the conscience? So could you elaborate more on this?
Yeah, so before I get into this, first of all, Dr. Kevin Moore, his thesis is on this passage. It's a little book, you can buy it. I don't know exactly where. But it is great, in my opinion. It explains this super well, much more thoroughly than we will. So check that out if you have more questions. It's great. So yeah, I think what would be best is if we just sat down and read this first. So 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 16. It says, "Now I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things and keep the traditions just as I delivered them to you. But I want you to know that the head of every man is Christ, the head of woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonors his head, but every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, for that is one and the same as if her head were shaved. For if a woman is not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it is shameful for a woman to be shorn or shaved, let her be covered. For a man indeed ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. For man is not from woman, but woman from man, nor was man created for the woman, but woman for the man. For this reason, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels." Of note here, I'm reading from the New King James. The phrase "a symbol of" is added. It's an interpretive tool. It's not in the original, and that'll be important later. Nevertheless, neither is man independent of woman, nor woman independent of man in the Lord. For as woman came from man, even so man also comes through woman, but all things are from God. Judge amongst yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given to her for a covering. But if anyone seems to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God. Okay, so this passage is confusing. The things that Peter talks about, where Paul's writing, some things are hard to understand. This is, in my opinion, this is one of them. It seems like from verses 2 through 15 that Paul is making this long explanation, right? This long argument that men are not to have their head covered when praying or even have long hair, and women are to have a head covering on, right? There are some Christian groups that practice that. And then in verse 16, it says, "But if anyone seems to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God." So it seems like he's spending all this time making this really long argument. This is why, this is why, this is why. Yeah. But then at the very end, he just kind of throws it out and says, well, if anyone fights about it, it's fine. It doesn't matter. And I'll be honest, I struggled with this passage for so long. And I personally have switched, at least twice, I've distinctly switched my viewpoint. I first was like, I don't know. And then I was like, no, every woman needs to wear a head covering. And now I'm where I am now, which I don't think that's the case at all. Yeah, so what are your first impressions before we kind of move on into this?
First impressions are, I've always been of the mindset that this passage is clearly a conscience issue and more of a cultural thought, right? For example, if
can I challenge that a little bit?
Yes, that's where I'm going. So
okay.
let me make my point, because this is what I thought before, and then we had this conversation, and you changed my mind on that. Just it's a better way of thinking about this cultural argument of this verse that Luke will present for us, and I'm going to present the more. I think this argument, this way of thinking of this verse, is very mainstream.
Oh, yeah,
right?
It's 100% the mainstream
So,
view.
and the way you're going to explain it is not going to be that way. So brace yourselves. It's going to be very interesting. I thought this was very good. So way I've always thought of it is specifically with verse 16. But if anyone seems to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God. If you interpret this passage within the context of the world that they were living in, you look at the Corinthian church and the different Greek gods and goddesses, the temples that they had dedicated to prostitution. These women would shave their heads, meaning that they were a temple prostitute. So in my mind, there is this cultural reasoning as to why Paul is saying these things. And there's a broader principle being applied here, is that if there is something that gives off the image of sinfulness, we as a Christian should not participate in those things. Now, if within your culture that has literally no significance, then that principle still applies, right? In our culture, there is no sinful implication to a woman having a shorn head, right? Therefore, we are biblically authorized to do that. Now, this transitions into Luke's different way of thinking about this that I really like. I think this explains the cultural argument a little bit better than just that on the surface.
So there's a couple points here. And this is why, and like you said, right, that's kind of the mainstream view. It says at the very end, we have no such custom. So it's kind of saying, right, this is a cultural thing. Now, this is why I initially, this is one of the reasons why I initially changed my mind from I don't really know to I think every woman should have a head covering. This was my first inclination, right? In verse 14, it says, does not nature itself teach you that no man is to wear long hair? So Paul calls back to nature, which is beyond culture.
Yeah.
And then, also, if anyone is, the last passage, if anyone is contentious, we have no such custom, that reading is translation dependent.
Interesting.
Highly translation dependent. Now, some of them are wrong, but it is based in a translation. If you have the RSV, for example, the newest RSV says in verse 16, if anyone is disposed to be contentious, we recognize no other practice, nor do the churches of God.
So the complete opposite. Yeah.
New American Standard for the longest time read that way as well. We have no other practice. The modern New American Standard renders it the correct way because there is not a negation in the Greek terms. But the New American Standard, the modern one, says we have no such practice with a footnote. The practice that he's saying that we have no such of, they add the one advocated by Paul's opponents. So they still say it's no other.
Yeah, interesting.
So that's why I spoke to a very experienced man who believes very strongly that women are to wear head coverings. And these were some of the points that he brought up that challenged the mainstream view, and were convincing in my judgment at the time anyway. So I don't think it's as cut and dry. And this is the thing. I agree with the conclusion, but the logic is flawed for those reasons and also for a few others. This is one of those instances where it really, really, really helps if you can at least, if you know how to use an interlinear Bible, or basically a Bible with the Greek, or if you know how to handle the Greek language, just a basic amount, right? If you have a dictionary. And this is why, okay? So, first off, this is a chiasm, which, if you're not familiar, it is a poetic or rhetorical device that essentially, where each statement mirrors one on the opposite. It's like if you were to split an X down from top to bottom, right, and you have the two halves pointing towards the center. You have the first sentence and the last sentence, they are parallel. The second sentence and the second to last are also parallel, and so on, until you get to the middle. And you can construct this as a chiasm. Dr. Moore's book does that really well, and highlights the poetic similarities between them. And it points to verse 10. And this is the thing. So there are a few translational errors. And this is the thing, right? Our English Bibles are translated extremely well, but they're not flawless because they were translated by fallible men. And this is one of those instances where it was confusing and they messed up. So first of all, in verse 16, it is, we have no such practice. There is no negation. That's the correct rendering. In another translational point, right? A symbol of authority. That's added because of the interpretive reading of this passage.
Yeah.
That's not in the original. So if you read verse 10, I need to switch to New King James here. New King, if I can find it. No.
Somewhere in there.
This, I tell you, this website. Okay, here we go. In verse 10, it says, for this reason the woman ought to have authority on her head, right? The symbol of is added because it's an interpretation. It's like, oh, the veil is a symbol. Well, that's an interpretation. It's not in the original. The third error in translation is actually in this word authority. In the original Greek, this word is exousia, which can mean authority, but it also means liberty. And in 1 Corinthians, right, this is where context is helpful, because in 1 Corinthians, this word is exclusively translated as liberty, except in verse 10. And with the chiasm, right, pointing to verse 10, what Paul is saying, the point he's making here, right, is this is a matter of liberty. This is a matter of choice. Now, what TJ was saying about this was a cultural practice given prostitution practices and how you would be able to identify that among common women with their head shaved. This was a cultural practice, but the point that he's making here in verse 10 is the same point that he makes later, I believe in verse 7. This word is also used to mean liberty of choice as well. It's used several other passages. It's used like this in Romans.
Yes, very much in Romans.
It is pointing to the fact that, right, this is a matter of judgment. This is not a matter of doctrine. This is a matter of liberty. You can, you don't have to, you choose. And there are, this is one of those things where it's complicated. It's made overly complicated because translators are interpreters and they have imposed their interpretation on when they translate. And
the point that I think you're trying to make, and I'll kind of like summarize the point you're trying to make so it's maybe a little easier to digest, is that the reason that this principle, or the reason that this command is a matter of Christian liberty is because God said so. It's not because of the culture. It's because God said so. Now, the extra reasoning is, well, this applies because, like, we can interpret the culture because this is a matter of liberty. If it weren't a matter of liberty, then no matter what culture we were in, we would have to do these.
Yes.
But because it's a matter of liberty, we can
have the judgment to apply the principles
no matter
found
what
therein.
culture we're in.
Correct.
Yep.
There are some cultures in which this is still a practice,
Yep.
and if I were to live there, my wife would do it because it would be following the principles found here. That this is a matter of judgment, and in order for the world to know that my wife respects me and that we are married, she would follow those practices.
Yep.
Right. So this is, like you were saying, it's a matter of liberty because God said so, not just because it was a cultural practice.
Yeah, definitely. So, well, that really about does it for our Q&A number 1 in this. I guess it's not really a series, but we're just going to keep doing it. So please,
unless this one absolutely bombs.
Yeah, unless you absolutely detest questions and answers and you hate asking questions, please love asking questions. Watch the video, please. We love this. We love asking questions. So that being said, please, if you want to submit those questions, we love hearing from you. So please feel free to email us at beyondthebuilding51314@gmail.com. You can also comment on YouTube. Leave us a message on Instagram, where you can find us at Beyond the Building Official. And with that, we will see everyone in the next episode of Beyond the Building.
Holy message shining, thy light shall guide me in the narrow way. Precept and promise, law and love combining, till night shall vanish in eternal day.